Hi, this is Sean D'Souza, and you're listening to the 3-Month Vacation Podcast. This podcast isn't some magic trick about how to work less. Instead, it's about how to really enjoy the work that you do and to enjoy your vacation time. Hi, I'm Sean D'Souza, and you're listening to the 3-Month Vacation. In the last few episodes, we talked about resistance, and the reason why we talk about resistance is because it affects us all. It doesn't matter how motivated we are, we still slip into that stage where we don't want to look at anything. Like the past few weeks, I didn't want to look at the postcards, and you know that I'm sending out a postcard every single day of the year. Well, I didn't want to look at it. I didn't want to look at some of my diary cartoons, which I do every day, but I slipped, and then you have to get back. And in today's episode, we're going to go back to that topic of resistance. But we're going to talk about 3 very unusual things. The first thing is about how inspiration helps. The second is about lousy carpenters versus good carpenters. And finally, we'll look at trigger time and how triggers make a huge difference to your resistance factor. Let's start off with the first thing, which is how inspiration helps. John Ford is a copywriter, and he lives in Paris. And he's a good friend online. We've never met, but he's a good friend, and he has a great newsletter. And me, I'm Sean D'Souza, which of course makes it really weird when I say that I used myself for inspiration. It sounds more than weird, it sounds egocentric. But let me assure you that it has nothing to do with ego, and it has everything to do with desperation. When I started writing articles for my website back in 2001, I was at best a cartoonist. If you asked me to draw something, you had a bouncy volunteer right beside you. But if you asked me to write, the bounciness would fade away pretty quickly. Not only did I not consider myself an average writer, but I had enough reason to be afraid of writing. And the reason I was afraid was because of a girl named Claire. I remember writing an article way back in the year 1991. I wanted to be a copywriter. In one of my diverse moods, I decided I want to make some more money, and I decided I want to write for the newspapers. So I met up with this guy called C.Y. Gopinath, and this is back in India. And he ran this writing agency, and he gave me an assignment which I diligently went about trying to finish. Now, there was this girl, Claire, who worked with him, and she was in charge of editing my assignment. And when Claire was done, I couldn't recognize the thing at all. I couldn't recognize what I'd written. There was so much editing, so much added, so much removed, that it seemed to me like it wasn't my work at all. And today, I can't even remember the subject of the article, but I remember the memory of that frustration. I remember that I didn't want to be a writer. Who cares about writing articles anyway? I could be a cartoonist instead. I could write ad copy. Claire wouldn't be around to edit my stuff. And there I was, 10 years into the future, and Claire was still bothering me. In fact, on most days, article writing was a drudgery. I wrote articles because I was forced to do so. I knew that I was supposed to update my website. I knew that one of our alliances, which was Marketing Profs at the time, they would be asking for an article because they did so every week. And somehow I had to banish Claire from my head and take away that fear of writing. Article writing was intense drudgery. I hated every bit of article writing. I hated the start, the middle, and I couldn't be sure of the end. If I completed an article in one day, I'd be extremely happy. Most of the times it would take me 2 days. 2 whole days, and I couldn't tell you whether that article would be fit to print. I couldn't tell you whether I would even finish the article or it would end up in the article writing graveyard. Thankfully, it was only 2 days in the whole month. But at this point, I decided to get inspiration from my own articles. I started looking back at the ones I'd completed, and I felt this immense sense of satisfaction, even inspiration. And so before writing, I'd look in my previous headlines, I'd read my own articles, and I'd feel a sense of accomplishment. That put a little bit of juice in my reserve tank, and that propelled me off the starting point. Of course, I'd cough and I'd sputter, but at least I was writing a new article. It didn't make things much better. I was still a very foul person to be around on article writing days. So I had to search for inspiration that went beyond me, and inspiration came in the form of a guy named John Ford. And I loved the way John wrote. I still do. His writing seems so effortless. He seems to be having so much fun. And he knew his topic, unlike me back then, who mostly knew about cartooning. And so I'd read many of John's articles. At one point, after getting to know him, I even asked him for an archive of sorts, so I could read all his stuff, going way back, and so that I could be inspired. John's writing and my writing, they both nudged me on. And while I got better over the years, there was a moment in time when I got radically better, and that moment was when I promised my members, that's at 5000 BC, that I would write 5 articles a week. Of course, no one paid attention, but I had promised them 5 articles a week, and so I was trapped in a way. I had to write those articles. Now, if you thought that writing 1 article is hard, 5 seems like pure agony. And I found it to be quite the opposite. The moment I started writing 5 and even 6 articles a week, something changed rapidly. Not all at once, of course, but in a few months, I found that I could sit down at my computer and turn out 5 articles in the course of a day. That was 2004. Then we fast forward to 2008, and I surprised myself again. I wrote 350 pages of content in a little over 4 weeks. So I wrote a book on chaos planning, on the secret life of testimonials, and one of the 3 parts on black belt presentations. These are all books that are on our website. And this was while doing all other stuff like tending to forum posts on 5000 BC, answering email, creating new websites, blogs, doing all these things together, and I managed to write 350 pages. And when you look at it from the outside, it's easy to think, this guy is crazy. I could never be like that. But I don't see it that way. I don't see the same Sean as you do. I see the Sean who struggled with Claire's edit. But I see that plot, I see that drudgery of writing articles. I can reflect back on the fear that I felt when I promised to write 5 articles a week. It was a moment of madness, but that's what I promised. And I know that anyone can do it. The best part is that you don't have to slave for almost 10 years like I did. Or if you go back in time to Claire, 20 years. You can do it within 3 to 6 months. It's still going to be a slog, but you can do it. So how does resistance play a role in all of this? The beauty was that the inspiration and the deadline both played its role. The inspiration came from John Ford's stuff. It came from my own stuff. And then we had the deadline. We had the deadline where I had to write the article for Marketing Profs. We had the deadline where I had to write the articles for 5000 BC. And because I had these 2 combinations of inspiration and deadline, that's why I became a writer. And there are times when you're going to be super frustrated, and the only inspiration you're going to have is your own work or someone who you admire. If you persist, that's when that resistance starts to melt away. You'll get enormously better at what you do, and you will be an inspiration to others. Imagine that. So that brings us to the end of the first part, which is inspiration and deadline. Let's go to the second part, which is about bad carpenters versus good carpenters. It is said that bad carpenters blame their tools, but what is not said is what makes a good carpenter. A good carpenter isn't always the one who has the best equipment, but a good carpenter makes sure that he learns how to use that equipment fluently. And there's a reason why you need to spend time learning how to use the equipment. Let's take my early battles with InDesign, for instance. Now, InDesign is a layout program in which I do all my ebooks and reports. I learned InDesign, but not quite well enough. So if I had to do a simple task like updating the contents page, I had to manually update it. I'd add more pages to my document, and then I'd have to go back and then reassign all the page numbers. And even if you haven't got a clue of what I'm talking about, you get this feeling of stupidity coming through. Stupidity and hard work, and all because I refused to learn how to maximize the program's capability. But forget about maximization. Let's just talk about fixing that immediate problem. No matter what you do right now, there's always a better way to do it. And there is someone there on the internet who can help you find a better way. For all you know, there are probably 10,000 tutorials and 50 videos on solving your exact problem. But guess what? You're doing the same old stuff in the same old way, and resistance loves you for it. It loves that you have great tools and lousy habits, because if you did what I did with InDesign, it would take you thrice as much time to do the same job. Maybe even 10 times as much. Well, guess what? If it takes you 5 minutes to do a job versus 50 minutes, which job is going to tire you out more? What you've just done is opened up the door to be completely exhausted. And it's not just exhaustion, but frustration as well. The more dissatisfied and tired you are, the better resistance feels. It doesn't have to do any work at all. You know, when we do this kind of thing, we're just nincompoops. We've done all the work for resistance ourselves. We are the bad carpenters. We blame our tools, when in reality we should be working very hard to maximize those tools that we already have, to learn them better. And let's face it, we need better tools as well. If we're running with outdated tools, it doesn't help. But often we're so glitzy-eyed for the best tools, and yet we don't put aside enough time to learn them well. But the question does arise. So many tools are very complex. Like, look at InDesign, it's very complex. How do you get the time to learn them well? The answer lies in doing continuous sweeps, almost like radar. If you try and learn something for the first time, you only pick up so much. So you come back for a second sweep, and then the third and the fourth. And so I spent a lot of time, about a month, first trying to work out how to use InDesign. Now I know it well, but I still spend a good hour or two every month to learn tiny bits of InDesign. And it helps me improve my productivity. Of course, InDesign also keeps getting better, so now not only am I faster, but I'm equipped with superior equipment. And resistance doesn't like that one little bit. It would prefer to see me swearing. It would love to see me frustrated. But I won't let it win, and neither should you. If you're a good carpenter, you will learn how to maximize your tools. Then you will earn more because you'll be in demand, and that will help you get the fanciest, most sophisticated tools. And that will put you head and shoulders above everybody else. And more importantly, it'll keep resistance away from your door. So we've covered two parts. The first part was about inspiration and deadline. The second one was about taking the tools that we already have and using them to their maximum potential. And this takes us to our third part, which is trigger time. Right now I'm sitting here resisting like crazy. It's 5:33 a.m. and I should have been out for a walk, but no, I'm doing this podcast instead. However, let's say it wasn't 5:33. Let's say it was, say, 2:30 in the afternoon. In that case, I wouldn't be writing an article, would I? I'd be well on the road, come rain or shine, because that's when I have to pick up my niece from school. And I don't drive to her school, I walk. So every day I get 20 minutes of walking, no matter what happens. I can't procrastinate by drawing or writing or just lazing around. I have to put on my shoes and then I have to walk. So I have this trigger that forces me to get someplace at a specific time. If you are to beat resistance, you can't afford to just wait for inspiration. While inspiration is all nice and fuzzy, you need to have a specific trigger. And if the trigger doesn't exist, then you have to create it. For some people, it's just the peer pressure of the group. Like for instance, in 5000 BC, we have a taking action group. And I mentioned the postcard stuff. I was going to write the postcards every single day. I mentioned that. And I also mentioned this eye exercise that I wanted to do to improve my eyesight. And they started to bug me, which is what they're supposed to do. So there's the peer pressure. And the moment that trigger is activated, then I'm forced to do whatever I promised to do. When your car is running out of fuel, you don't sit and wait for inspiration to strike. You have your trigger. It's flashing in front of you and you pop into the nearest fuel station and you refuel. So then we wake up and we're faced with a mountain of email, tons of things to do, and distractions like Facebook. And then before we know it, the day is wildly out of control. So everyone is prone to wayward days, and I have to have these triggers in place. So how do I use the trigger when doing all the things that I do? The first is I use the Taking Action Forum, and the second is I use external deadline. So now the Taking Action Forum is the forum in 5000 BC, and you might have another system, but I'll give you the concept here. Here's how I go about it. If I have a big project to finish, I can't depend on my own ability to beat resistance, so I need help. And I go to the Taking Action Forum in 5000 BC, I list my project. Then along comes someone and they help me get the job done. The trigger, as you can see, is that I have to keep posting my updates every day. So I better get some work done if I'm to keep that post going. And so that's my trigger. But if I wanted to make this trigger even sharper, I'd put in a time. I'd say 5:22 p.m. every day. That's when I show up and I report back. And so then I have to update that action plan, and this Taking Action plan helps me get ahead. But there are times when I can find wiggle room and get out of even a Taking Action plan. And for this, I need something bigger. I need something that is finite, that I cannot budge. And that's called the external deadline. So what's an external deadline? I had been writing the Black Belt presentation book series for almost a year. I'd completed most of it, but I still wasn't able to get about a fourth of the book done. And you know as well as I do that an unfinished job is like an uncooked dish. No one is going to be interested in it. And because of the size of the job and the number of elements involved, I was getting hit on the head big time by resistance. So the Taking Action Forum nudged me on, but what I needed was a swift kick. So what I did was I pre-sold the product. I said on April 1st, this product is going to be out. And then the pressure was on. Of course, I got exhausted. Of course, there was pressure. Of course, I was intimidated. And then I thought, okay, let me just postpone this to April 7th. But just before April 1st, I started getting emails asking me what time I could deliver on April 1st. So there was no way out of this trigger. I had to soldier on, and some days I woke up at 2:30 a.m. for quite a while, actually, and I got the job done. Procrastination happens all the time, and resistance gets hold of you, and it's very difficult to get out of it. And the best way to beat it is to work on something like the Taking Action Forum in your own way. And if that doesn't work, have an external deadline. Something that you cannot budge. I can cheat myself out of a walk on any given day. I can cheat myself out of a walk by making an excuse. But there is no way to get out of picking up my niece from school. And that is when I get my walk, and that is when I listen to the podcast. So having an external deadline, an external trigger that you cannot budge, that's what makes all the difference, and that's what beats resistance every single time. So now it's 5:41 a.m. and I still haven't gone for the walk, but I will. And I will pick up Marsha later today, and I'll kill resistance twice over. That brings us to the end of this podcast. What have we covered in this podcast? The first thing we looked at was inspiration and deadline. And sometimes to beat resistance, you have to go back into yourself, into the good times, the stuff where you were successful at writing an article or doing whatever it is that you were doing. And you need that inspiration, that feeling of exhilaration to come rushing back into you. But you also need the deadline. And John Ford really helped me along the way. And I helped myself by looking at my own stuff. So inspiration is where we start. The second thing, however, is the tools that you have. You have software that can do amazing stuff. And software saves enormous amounts of time, but if you've not spent time exploring that software, then you're not going to use it to its full potential. And if there is something that you use every single day, go out and look at some tutorials on how to save time using that software that you use every single day. And you will find that you can save minutes and then hours every week by figuring out what you already have. Then you can charge more. Then you can get better software and do even quicker stuff, and then spend more time at the beach or at the cafe or somewhere else. And finally, we looked at this factor of triggers. And triggers are just things that you can't budge. You can't get out of it. And the same thing applies to an external deadline. If I want to get something done, I sell it, and even if one person buys it, then I have to meet that deadline. And that's what causes me to achieve all the stuff that I do. It's just because of an external deadline. Left to myself, I'd rather be on the couch doing absolutely nothing. But I also enjoy what I do, and I'm so glad that external deadlines push me and push resistance out of the way. So what's the one thing that you can do today? The one thing that you can do today is to look at the software that you have. I'll give you an example. Every time I saved a URL from my FTP server, I would have all of this extra code that would come in. And for years, I'm talking about like 10 years now, I have been cutting out that extra code and then putting in the code that's required. And then I found that my software, Text Expander, it could do that in 1 second. So think of how many years of this stuff I have been going round and round, cutting and pasting and replacing, cutting and pasting, replacing, when now it takes me 1 second. So you have to ask the question, how can I do this faster? Because you're a lousy carpenter and I'm a lousy carpenter if we don't take the tools that we have and we don't sharpen them and don't make them better. And then, of course, when better tools come along, we should use them as well. So Not upgrading the software, that's not a great idea. Not learning the software, not a great idea. And that's when resistance wins. So that's the one thing you can do. Look at the software that you have and then say, what am I doing here with this software that's so repetitive? There has to be a better way. And there will be a better way. And that's what you need to do today. So what's happening in psychotactics land? I've been reading quite a few books recently on talent and productivity. And one is by Charles Duhigg. I don't know if you read The Power of Habit. That's a really good book. I think that was a better book than the one that he's just released, which I also read. The other book that I'm reading is called Peak, P-E-A-K, and that's by Kay Anders Ericsson, and you might want to read that as well. Other than that, I'm finishing off the notes for the article writing course, and that's going really well. The article writing course itself is going really well, and we were on our walk yesterday, and I decided that we're going to have just limited spaces. So now you think, well, every course has limited spaces. Well, no. Most people fill it up with 400 or 500 folk and maybe 1,000. And it's all about making money, because at the end of the day, you can't teach 500 people. You can't teach 50 people. You need maybe 25, and then you can actually spend time with them. And that's what our courses are about. But on the other hand, I decided that we're only going to release 25 self-study issues at any point in time. So that's just self-study copies, just 25. And it sounds bizarre, but that's it. We're going to sell 25. We think that's enough for us. And so it's 25 in a live course, 25 self-study. And will it be urgent for the people buying it? Of course it will be. But for us as well, it puts a limit. We've done our 25, we're happy, and we go along our lives. And it's something that you might want to consider as well. How you can have just enough and be happy with it. And now I can keep talking, or I can go for my walk. So I'm going to go for the walk. I'm going to put this podcast to bed, and it'll soon be uploaded. Thanks for listening. If you haven't already left a review on iTunes, please do so. I look at the testimonials, not always just to make me happy, but also for the wording that you use, why you listen to this podcast. So if you go to psychotactics.com/iTunes, it'll take you directly to iTunes, and you can leave a testimonial there, and I would really appreciate it. If you have any questions, I'm at Sean D'Souza on Twitter and Sean D'Souza on Facebook, and at Sean@psychotactics.com. Bye for now.